I made a Warlock tier list video recently and you guys were not very happy, so I figured the only right thing to do was double down and make a Hunter tier list ranking every single exotic under the following tiers. A is for things that are good, B is for things that are decent, C is anything okay, but obviously there's going to be much better options, D is just bad, and F is dog shit. Then, as always, S tier is for the most standout exotics in the game that really shape the meta for builds when it comes to hunters. Also, keep in mind this list is for Endgame PvE. Yes, that does include some raids and dungeons, but with a much larger emphasis on GMs, low-mans, speedruns, and day one raids. Hopping straight into the list with exotic boots first, our very first pair are going to be the Speedloader Slacks. With these, anytime you dodge, yourself and then all allies within 15 meters get a buff called Tight Fit, which starts at 1 stack. To increase these stacks up to ×5, which is the max stack count, all you need to do is keep getting kills or dodging repeatedly to get up to ×5, where you're getting a plus 55 increase to your reload stat and your handling stat, along with some other smaller bonuses. This can actually be really strong in the current meta because of things like Izanagi and rocket swapping, which do require increased handling and then reload speed from their base values to become more effective against bosses in things like raids or dungeons. That being said, there are many other ways to increase your reload speed and handling for these rotations. I think Speedloader Slacks are just really good because you can apply this all to your team and free up other people's exotic slots, but that comes at a cost of it being pretty situational. I think where you can use this effectively, it's great, but you can't use it effectively in a ton of different locations. So for that reason, I think it's a good B tier exotic. Second on the list are going to be Frostees, which the only major benefit of these are the increased ability cooldown whenever you are sprinting, which is going to be double the cooldown rate for your melee and grenade. And then with this, you get 100% additional base cooldown for your class ability. This does sound like it's the same thing where double or 2x is typically equivalent to 100%, but with the way that cooldowns work in the game, stating whether it's additional base cooldown versus just a multiplier does make a slight difference. Either way, no matter what, I think these are a B tier exotic. I think they're pretty solid. I would use them in a lot of builds that don't have a set exotic, but I don't think they really change the game that drastically. Orpheus Rigs are up next, and these are a personal favorite exotic choice for me, especially when rocking Void Hunter, because Void Hunter is really strong, especially in endgame content. But that being said, whenever you use this with Deadfall, which is the single shot tether, and you hit a bunch of enemies, you're getting up to 50% of your super back, and I believe this also gives 10% to each ability per enemy you hit as well. So you can max out your abilities by using this as well. And then whenever you're using Quiver, which is the multi-shot tether, instead of having 2 shots, you now have 3 shots. That being said, I think this is way more useful to run on Deadfall so that you can get your super back and keep chaining it. It isn't as strong as it used to be where you get your full super back. I still think you have to kind of micromanage your build to be able to use this in between damage phases effectively and chain supers effectively. But either which way, I think these are one of the strongest exotics in the game for most content. So I think that's an easy A tier pick. Lucky Pants are next on the list. With this, anytime you ready a hand cannon, for 5.5 seconds, each shot is going to deal 60% additional damage, as long as you're landing these shots, obviously, and that stacks all the way up to a cap of 600% damage after 10 shots. This is really good for burst damage, especially against things like champions, and is even currently used in the solo Nez final stand bake for Hunter. That being said, I think it's a pretty niche exotic. It comes into play a lot because champions are really prevalent in the game. So I think for that reason, it's an A tier exotic. I think a lot of people would think it's S tier because of what it's able to do with just primaries, but I don't think it's really that strong. I think it's great to take into things like GMs or anywhere else that there is a champion that needs to be quickly dealt with, but I don't think it's really an S tier. I think A tier is pretty fair. Gemini Jesters are up next, and they're definitely more of a PvP exotic, but in PvE, whenever you dodge, these are going to disorient enemies for 5 seconds within 22 meters of that dodge. The range is actually pretty insane in my opinion, but disorient is not equivalent to suppression or blinding enemies or anything like that, so it doesn't synergize with any subclass 3.0, which definitely takes it down a tier, and with that, the disorientation only lasts 5 seconds, which is borderline useless. I would say that you could use it, so I'm not going to put it in F tier, but you should practically never use it. So I think D tier is the perfect spot. Star Eaters are up next, and I think everybody knows exactly what this does and probably where it's going to be going on the list. That being said, the two things that not as many people are aware of is that you can use this to effectively get overshields after you're already at ×4 Feast of Light, and it does also increase the super energy gains that you get when collecting Orbs of Power. That being said, the main reason to use this exotic is to collect 4 total orbs of power after your super is fully charged, and then with those 4 orbs, when you use your super, it does 70% increased damage no matter what super you're running. That being said, this is super strong because 70% is one of the highest increases to ability or super damage in the entire game. And then with that, hunters have probably the best supers in the entire game as well. Like Stick is really good, and then Blade Barrage is also really good for instant cast burst damage. And then even things like Golden Gun are really useful for infinite Golden Gun chaining, where you're still getting that max 70% increased damage. So this is easily one of the best exotics in the entire game and is an easy S tier pick. I've covered Radiant Dance Machines a ton this season already. I think this is one of the best exotics in the entire game ever since its pretty massive rework. With these, anytime you dodge within a specific range to an enemy, I think it's around 16 meters or something like that, you get infinite dodges for the next 5 seconds, where anytime during those 5 seconds, kills add another 5 seconds to the timer, which is pretty wild. With these equipped, you can easily just use something like Forbearance to spam, dodge, and just never have to reload for some of the best ad clear that you can have in the entire game. But more important than that, if you're using Marksman Dodge with something like a rocket launcher and Wolfpack rounds, you can proc this, spam rockets, and let the Wolfpack rounds actually get kills for you, or you can always just proc it, get a kill, and then have 10 seconds of infinite dodges and get all your rockets off that way. Not to mention, with the buff, you can even use this to just spam 4 rockets with like Cold Comfort with the Finisher and Envious Assassin, and then you can just go straight into dodging for some of the quickest boss bakes in the entire game. I think this is an easy S tier option. I know a lot of people will tell me it's probably A or B tier, but if you truly play endgame content and you're going for boss bakes, this is one of the best things that you can use, and I think a lot of people tend to sleep on it. The Bombardiers are up next, and these things are pretty cheeks. With these equipped, when you dodge, you're leaving behind a Parting Gift, which is essentially a bomb that explodes after 1.5 seconds and deals, in my opinion, a pretty decent amount of damage to enemies. It's nothing insane, but it's not trash. More important than that, it does synergize with your subclass. So if you're on Solar, you're going to be scorching enemies. If you're on Stasis, you slow, Strand severs, and then you blind on Arc and suppress on Void. That being said, the compendium does say it's a light form of blind and a light form of suppression that doesn't seem to synergize with other things, so I doubt this is effectively used to stun champions. But I have used this on Arc, and I thought it felt pretty good with a combination blow setup where you're spamming melees and dodges, and those dodges are obviously blinding everything in the area. So it's kind of similar to how Assassin Cal plays, but instead of going invis, you're blinding everything. I don't think it's anywhere near as strong, plus something like Assassin's Cal obviously offers healing, but I think it could be another substitute if Assassin's Cal ever gets nerfed. So for now, I'll leave it as a C tier exotic that you could use, but I wouldn't recommend it. Lastly, to end things off for the boots, we obviously have Stompees, which are by far the best movement exotic for hunters in the game. With these, you're buffing your sprint speed, your slide distance, and then obviously the jump height for each of the different jump variations that hunters have access to. I think other than maybe Blink, I don't know if Blink gets any benefits. These are fantastic for skips. I know they did get nerfed so that if you do use your dodge, then you lose the benefit of Stompees effectively. But that being said, I think these are still one of the best exotics in the entire game. I'm going to throw them as a B tier option. If you're doing speedruns and things like that, they're obviously going to be closer to like A tier, maybe even S tier for movement. But I think as far as like movement goes for most people in the game, even most forms of endgame content other than speedruns, they're not as useful. So I think B tier is a pretty fair place to put them. Moving on to chest pieces, we are starting the list off with Omnioculus, which is probably the most debated or controversial exotic in the entire game. I think people either think it's S tier or all the way down in like D or F tier. And to prove that, I posted this list on YouTube for my original version of it, just to see what people thought, and everybody told me that Omni was deserving of S tier. And when I posted something similar on Twitter, pretty much everybody was saying that Omni was useless in endgame content. That being said, I'm going to be placing this as an A tier exotic and explaining why I think this is the perfect spot for it. As most people know, with this exotic, you get 2 smoke bombs, and if you hit a teammate with the smoke bomb, you get half that smoke bomb back, or 50%. And then if you hit 2 or more teammates with the smoke bomb, you're obviously fully refunding it. For that reason, I think this is really, really strong if you're doing GM carries in Grandmaster Nightfalls, because Infinite Invis is really good, but only if you're carrying really inexperienced players that need that invis to crutch and to stay alive. A lot of people also say the 50% DR that you get while invis is really strong. I don't think it comes into play that much, because if you're invis, things tend not to target you. So the only time that 50% comes into play is if something's about to hit you and then you instantly pop invis to tank it. Other than that, the only real reason I see to use this exotic is if you want 2 smoke bombs for the weaken effect to apply a debuff, but in almost every single team-based setting, you might as well just use a tether or have somebody on tractor cannon to get the exact same effect. I don't think it's super useful in any other area than Grandmaster Nightfall carries. For that reason, I do think it's fair to put it as an A tier exotic. It's definitely not S tier. I would probably put it in B tier myself, and I understand the arguments for C or D tier if you don't really think GMs are hard, because they're really not that bad. Up next, we have Sixth Coyote, which just gives you an additional dodge charge for 2 dodges, no matter what subclass you're playing. In my opinion, the only time this is really useful is going to be when you're running Strand, and you can use the Suspending Dive so that you have 2 Suspending Dives, and then you can also pair it with a Shackle Grenade, for example, so that you have 3 different ways to suspend enemies, or at least 2 different ways and 3 different instances that you can suspend, so that you can effectively immobilize anti-barrier champions, you can stun unstops, and then also deal with overloads extremely easily because they're not teleporting around. For that reason, only for Strand, I think this is an A tier exotic for how potent Strand is in GMs, but as soon as the spend starts getting nerfed, I think this will really fall down the list because it's been in the game for a while and it hasn't been useful on any other subclass until now, in my opinion. Lucky Raspberry is an OG exotic and it's pretty simple. With this, instead of having your Arc Bolt Grenade chain 3 total times, it now goes up to 4 total times. And then with this, every single enemy that you hit increases the chance to refund your next grenade by 25%, which means if you effectively chain this to 4 total enemies, that gives you a 100% chance for the grenade to be refunded, giving you infinite grenades as long as you have 4 or more enemies to chain with. And even if you just have 1 enemy, you could potentially get lucky and chain this back to back on a 25% luck streak. So for that being said, I think it's pretty good. I don't think Arc Bolts are the strongest grenade in the entire game. They're not weak, but they're pretty solid for ad clear, which is what grenades tend to be used for in general anyways. So I think this is a solid B tier exotic. Raiden Flux is the very next exotic chess piece on the list. With this, very simply, we're just buffing our Arc Staff super. As we're getting kills, we get increased damage for the super and then a decrease in the rate at which our super energy is being drained. The damage is going to increase to, I believe, 46.2% exactly after 3 kills, which is the max amount of stacks. And then I have no idea what the drain rate for the super is. I can't find values for that anywhere. That being said, you can definitely feel that it's draining much slower. I think ad kill based supers or roaming supers aren't really strong in the current meta. So I'm going to put this in C tier. If ad clear supers were better, this would be one of the best ad clear super exotics in the entire game, in my opinion. But like I said, just these supers kind of suck. So C tier is pretty fair. Ophidia Spathe very simply just gives you 2 knife charges, which means it only works on the solar subclass because no other subclass has knives. I feel like this would be way better if it just flat out gave you 2 melee charges no matter what subclass you ran. But that being said, the somewhat nice part about this is if you are missing both and you do a Gambler's Dodge, you're gonna get both melee charges back. It's super gimmicky. I can't think of one reason that you would want 2 melee charges, especially since you can infinitely chain your melees while you're Radiant and proc Radiant through Ember of Torches, so you never really need another melee as long as you don't whiff your melee and you keep getting kills. I think it's pretty much useless, but you could use it to just spam melees for a gimmicky build. For that reason, I'm going to put it as a D tier exotic, which I don't think anybody would ever argue it's better than. Raiju's Harness is another PvP-esque exotic in my opinion. With this, you can block and use your super as long as you're not attacking with it, and it'll last 30% longer because your super drains 30% slower with this exotic equipped. And then when you come out of it, you're also able to get some of your super energy straight back, you'll blind enemies, and you do also get 21 seconds of ×4 arc weapon surges. In my opinion, I don't think it's really worth it to run for the surges to pop your super and then come straight back out of it. It's also not really worth using it to block in PvE, especially when things like Banner Shield exist. It could have a niche use, but in my opinion, I think it's a D tier pick, and it doesn't have anywhere else to be used in PvE. Gyrfalcon's Hauberk is obviously one of the best exotics in the entire game. Just as a recap, with this, the main benefit we get is volatile rounds for void weapons anytime we come out of being invis, which can then be paired with Stylus Executioner on the void subclass, which makes us invis anytime we kill a void debuffed target, aka an enemy that is volatile. This has an amazing chain, and then with this, you can also do a finisher to give yourself a reserve overshield and also to your teammates, along with a 35% weapon damage increase. It's easily one of the best exotics in the entire game and can be paired with things like Devour to make you pretty much invincible and other invis effects to allow you to quickly cycle through the build with different means of going invis. So for that reason, I think it's easily an S tier exotic for one of the best builds in the entire game. Gwisin Vest seems like it could be good on paper, but it's actually pretty trash. With this, as you're getting kills and then you use your heavy attack with the Spectral Blade super, you get a portion of your super back, again, depending on how many kills you got. I think this caps out at 5 total kills, but it ends up being more effective to just get 1 or 2 kills and then use the heavy attack because it falls off pretty heavily around 4 and 5 kills where you're not getting that much extra super energy. But the other main issue with this is the super drains crazy quickly as is. Like I said, ad clear supers suck in the current meta, and by the time that you do the heavy attack and get that animation to go through, you've already lost some of the percentage of your super, even though you're getting some percentage back. So it's really not that effective because it doesn't apply instantly. I think you could use it in some aspects of PvE, but it's obviously a D tier exotic, and you could even argue that it's F tier because of how bad Spectral Blades currently are. Lastly, to end things off for the chest piece, we have the Dragon Shadow, which is one of the best exotics in the entire game. I love this thing, and it gets really slept on, but it's really good for boss kills, especially in a low man or speedrun setting. With this, upon dodging, you're going to get the perk Wraith Metal Mail. When you dodge, this will reload every single weapon, not just the one that you currently have equipped. And then within those 10 seconds that you have Wraith Metal Mail active, you get plus 100 handling, plus 100 reload speed. And then on top of this, you're also getting a 0.7x ready stow animation multiplier, which means you're getting max handling, but also still swapping weapons 30% quicker. With this, it's really good for weapon swap rotations, and oftentimes if you use a melee on something like a solar subclass with high mobility, you can chain this perk back to back, allowing you to really quickly swap between weapons, and then also incorporate things like rocket dodges so that you can spam rockets within those rotations very quickly. It's easily one of the best exotics in the entire game for dealing with bosses. I wouldn't argue that it's S tier, but I think it's pretty fair to put it as an A tier exotic if you play endgame content in the form of low mans and speedruns. Moving on to the gauntlets for hunters. First up, we have Triton Vice, which are brand new this season, and they center around making your glaive more effective. At base, whenever you're getting a melee kill, that's going to add +1 to your magazine and even overflow it up to 2x the original magazine size. On top of that, whenever you're surrounded, which is within 15 meters of 3+ enemies, you're going to be getting a 30% increase in the glaive's melee damage only. So it's kind of like a weaker form of surrounded built into any glaive that you're running while these are equipped. And then very lastly, anytime you get a glaive projectile final blow, as long as that glaive matches your subclass, it will detonate, dealing additional damage to all enemies within 4 meters. Overall, I think glaives are trash in PvE. A lot of people get mad when I say that glaives are trash, but honestly, if you're using a glaive, you're just kind of playing the game wrong. I'm sure this could be used in some specific builds. The surrounded extra 30% melee damage is super nice. So I think right now, just because glaives are terrible, it's a D tier exotic, but if glaives do ever get better in the future, this probably will bump up a few slots. Caliban's Hand is up next, and I absolutely love this exotic. I think it's super fun to play with. At base, whenever you're using your proximity knife and you get a kill, whether that's through the impact or the detonation of the proximity knife on an enemy, that enemy's corpse is then igniting, dealing a ton of damage to everything nearby and really making your ad clear much more effective. This pairs really well on solar builds, obviously for like Infinite Radiant and Infinite Restoration, and I know it's currently used for the solo Explicator strat for hunters in Root of Nightmares, but all of that being said, I think this build only works well whenever you have a ton of trash adds to Ignite with your proximity knives, and in any form of harder content when you're a bit under power, it scales down awfully. So for that reason, I think it's fair to put it as a B tier exotic. I know it's really strong, but as you start getting up into the A and S tier, this is for things that really work in any form of content, and I just think Caliban's Hand only works in really easy areas in the game. Khepri Sting is up next. With this exotic, we're also buffing one of our melee abilities, just like Caliban's Hand, but it's our Smoke Bomb on Void. That said, whenever your Smoke Bomb is ready to go and you just do a default melee, that's going to consume it. Your Smoke Bomb will also be dealing 50% more damage at base, and anytime you do use your Smoke Bomb, you're granted True Sight, so you can see enemies through the wall. On top of all of that, whenever your Smoke Bomb is attached to a wall and it hasn't detonated yet, you're getting 500% additional base regen for that melee ability. All of that said and done, this is way more of a PvP exotic. Extra damage for your Smoke Bomb doesn't really do anything in PvE because it's not really a damage ability anyways. The True Sight is pretty much useless because it's PvE once again. And then the 500% additional regen doesn't really come into play because you shouldn't just be throwing this against a wall and having enemies run into it. You should either be using it to apply weaken directly to enemies or use it for invis. So this has no place in PvE, in my opinion, so I think it's an easy F tier pick. Shards of Galanor are up next. With this, anytime you cast Blade Barrage and get hits on an enemy or even get kills, you're getting a percentage of your next super straight back, up to 50%, which is the hard limit. That being said, in the current state of the game, you hardly ever use supers, especially burst supers, to add clear enemies. With any boss phase, it's going to be more useful to use something like Star Eater Scale so you get much more damage off against the boss, because you can pretty much always get your next super back for the next damage phase as well with max stacks of Feast of Light. So for that reason, I think it's a fun exotic to use. You can use it in builds and have fun with it. It's useful, but not really great in the current meta, so C tier is perfect. Aeon Swifts are the next exotic for hunters on this list. Obviously, with these, you tend to run the finisher that generates heavy ammo against elites, bosses, mini-bosses, champions, things like that. And with this, paired with a Void Infinite Invis build and something like a GM, or even like a Suspending build, it's one of the best exotics in the entire game, because as you're constantly finishing enemies, you're always generating heavy ammo for your team. It's great in GMs, day one raid races, it's used even in low mans and speedruns. It is one of the best exotics in the entire game, and I think it's best on Hunter out of all the classes that I've played with this exotic on, especially in Grandmaster Nightfalls, so it's an easy S tier exotic. Mechaneer's Tricksleeve is up next. With this, very simply, whenever you are critically wounded and you pull out a sidearm, that sidearm deals 100% increased damage until you are no longer critical, meaning it is dog ass. It is a complete meme exotic. It is easily an F tier, and if you're using this, you should probably stop playing Destiny. Sealed Ahamkara Grasps are up next. With these, anytime you get a melee hit, it's going to automatically refill your entire magazine for all 3 of your currently equipped weapons. This used to be really good when the auto-loading nerf happened, and this was kind of used to subsidize that, but then because of that, it got a massive cooldown, which is a 7-second cooldown, meaning you only get that reload to proc once every 7 seconds. There are some other benefits to your jump height and mobility and things like that. I think you could use it in certain gimmicky builds and just to mess around with, but when something like Radiant Dance Machines exists, these are pretty much useless, so I think it's an easy D tier pick. Liar's Handshake is an exotic a lot of people know about. It used to be insane, but I feel like the usage rate is way lower now with stuff like Assassin's Cowl existing. That being said, with this, the main perk is called Cross Counter. Anytime you get meleeed or you melee an enemy, you get 3 seconds of the perk where your next melee attack is going to deal 200% increased melee damage, which makes it insane when you're buff stacking things like Combination Blow to deal a ton of extra melee damage. That being said, whenever you combine this with a 1-2 punch shotgun, which also gives 200% increased melee damage, Liar's Handshake doesn't give 200% anymore, and it only gives 80% while 1-2 punch is procced. So you can't use this to effectively stack super high. I think you used to always get the 200% and the 200%, but I believe it was nerfed. For that reason, it's definitely not an S tier exotic. I think you could still make the argument that it's an A tier, which is where I'm going to put it. It's really useful in certain boss kills and boss bakes, but it's not as useful in like a GM setting because your survivability just isn't there, and you still don't get that much extra damage. Renewal Grasps are up next. With these, they're going to buff your Duskfield grenades so that they have a larger AoE, allowing more enemies and players to fit inside of them. And then with that, anytime an enemy is inside of the Duskfield, it's going to be dealing 50% less damage to you and allies. While you're inside, you also get 25% additional damage resistance. And then you can pair this with something like Touch of Winter and the Stasis Crystal inside of that for even larger of an AoE. Plus, the crystal also offers damage resistance from some of the fragments that exist. So you can get a lot of DR, but I think the 50% from enemies being inside of it is pretty situational. Plus, you really don't want enemies to be that close to you in endgame content when you would use this much damage resistance. plus stasis is like super out of meta right now. I think these are usable. I think if stasis gets a solid buff, they could be a lot better, but I think right now in the current meta, they're a C tier option. Athrys' Embrace is up next. With this, you're buffing your weighted throwing knife. Anytime you're landing precision hits, you get a duration that increases up to 30 seconds of strengthened weighted knife. And with the strengthened weighted knife, it's going to be dealing 200% additional damage and is now also capable of stunning unstopped champions. That being said, I use this in Lost Sector gameplay in the background here, and it is not even capable of one-shotting champions, and I'm not even 25 under. There also isn't solar burn, so you could get an additional 25% damage from that, but by the time you're 25 under in a GM, it's not going to make that big of a difference. This also got hurt a lot because of the 1-2 punch nerf. 1-2 punch used to do 350% against champions. Now it only offers 200% melee damage. And I also even used this with Tractor Cannon for a 30% debuff as well. I don't think there's anything I could have done to really make this combo better other than, like I said, having solar surges. And I was also only like 13 under power. It's really not that great for end game content in my opinion. It used to be a little bit better. I'll put it in C tier. It's usable, but I would never recommend taking this into any Grandmaster setting. Oathkeepers are up next. With this exotic, very simply, you can indefinitely hold in a fully drawn bow shot with any bow that you have currently equipped. That being said, on top of this, you also have a bar on the left-hand side of your screen as you're drawing the arrow. Once it gets fully drawn, you have the next 2 seconds where you're charging up and getting increased damage up to a 150% damage increase. And then after 4 seconds, you're going to lose that damage. So you basically have it fully drawn for 2 seconds to get a 150% increase in your damage. And then if you don't fire it within those next 2 seconds, you lose that damage buff. I feel like it's just a really weird way to play in PvE. You could definitely use it, and I'm sure it's really good for like solo GMs playing really passively. For that reason, I'm going to put it as a D tier exotic. I don't think it really has a major place to play in the meta. I think you could use it really if you're using something like Wish Ender or even Leviathan's Breath for like ammo economy, solo GMs, whatever else, but I don't think it's really that strong of an exotic. Shinobu's Vow grants you 2 skip grenade charges, where the mini projectiles from these skip grenades can hit an enemy and give 4% of your nade back every time that they hit. Each of these little projectiles can hit 2 to 3 times in total, so that's anywhere from 8 to 12% per projectile back. And there's around 5 or 6 projectiles that go out in total. So you can easily get a ton of grenade energy back and have a really good cycle for both of your grenades when you apply mods to the build. That being said, when I've played with this, I either get a lot of grenade energy back or a very little amount of grenade energy back, and the damage seems super inconsistent as well. I think this is right on par with something like Lucky Raspberry, where you're playing for a more consistent playstyle rather than going off of the chance to get your grenade back, depending on how many enemies you hit. I think it's right on par. It's a different way to play the game, but pretty equivalent. So I think it's a fair B tier pick. I don't think it's really equal to anything in A tier or even S tier. Young Ahamkara Spine is up next. So many people love and know exactly what this exotic does, but the main things you're getting here is intrinsic fastball, which is great, the ability for your trip mines to no longer self-damage, which is huge for survivability, and then obviously the main thing is you get 33% of your nade back every time you deal damage with ability. So if you throw your nade and hit an enemy, that's 33% back. Then when the trip mine detonates, you get 33% back from that. With the knife trick, which throws 3 individual projectiles, you also get 33% per knife, so you can instantly refund a full grenade. It is amazing. It has one of the best ability damage and most satisfying ability spam cycles in the entire game. All of that said, I don't think it really competes with all these S tier options. I think it has pretty specific areas in the game where it's good. You can run it in a GM and it's okay. It's obviously amazing for some solo boss bakes and things like that. You could bring it into a day 1 raid setting, but you do need to move a lot inside of like a Well of Radiance to spam your dodge, so I think it's hard to use in a team-based setting. I think it's really fair to put this as an A tier exotic. I know a lot of people argue S tier, but I don't think it quite hangs with how versatile all these exotics really are. Lastly, for the video, we are moving on to exotic helmets, and we have the brand new helmet from Lightfall, which is called the Cyrtarachnes Facade or something like that. I have no idea how the hell you're supposed to pronounce this thing. It's also pretty damn trash. Okay, anytime you use your grapple ability, you are getting woven mail for 10 seconds. I know that that sounds pretty good, and it can work pretty well considering hunters have 2 grapple charges, and then they can also do pretty much infinite grapples from the in-air tangles or whatever the grapple points that they're making. That being said, in the current meta, Yes, Woven Mail is really strong, but it's way easier to just collect a ton of Orbs of Power that are on the ground and completely free up your exotic slot for anything else. I think this is easily a D tier exotic. In PvP, I can imagine it's actually pretty damn strong, but in PvE, it really has no place. Assassin's Cowl is an exotic that gives invis and healing whenever you get a finisher or melee final blow. The duration of invis and healing amount is increased anytime you do it against a higher tier enemy, and you also get a slight bonus from doing a finisher compared to the melees, because melees are a bit easier to get. That being said, everyone should know this is insanely strong with the current arc combination blow build, and I would argue it's also pretty strong in some lower end content that might not be GMs when you're using it with something like Knife Trick to constantly give yourself healing and invis effect as well. Not to mention, this is one of the only ways to get invis on any other subclass than Void. This is currently an S tier exotic in most people's eyes, but I would argue that if combination blow does get pretty heavily nerfed, this might fall down into the A tier range. Foe Tracer is up next, which is definitely a pretty niche exotic. With this, aiming at an enemy for 1 or more seconds is going to mark them for the next 5 seconds. So in any boss setting, which is when this is typically used, you're going to pretty much always have the boss marked as your priority target because that's the only thing you're aiming at. And then anytime the HP value of that enemy goes less than 30%, you're getting increased damage, where the damage you get is 1% more damage per percent that they're under 30% health, if that makes any sense. So if an enemy goes down to like 10% of its HP at that point in time, because they're 20% lower than 30%, you're getting 20% more damage. This just makes it so that the end of a boss phase tends to be a little bit easier and is useful for tighter boss-based settings, but you tend to really see this work in a rotation where you'll pop Golden Gun with Celestial, swap from Celestial to Foe Tracer, shoot your shot off, which still gets the Golden Gun benefit, and then you'll go into like a damage swapping rotation with like Slugs or Izanagi's Burden and a Rocket. Like I said, it's pretty niche, but in my opinion, I would use this well over everything in C and D tier, so I think putting it as a B tier exotic is fair. I know it's niche, but a lot of things C tier and below are just pretty much useless in my eyes for endgame content. Next up on the list, we have Celestial Nighthawk, which turns your Golden Gun into a singular shot, which does 6x the damage, which is a 500% increase, as long as you're using the precision-based Golden Gun, where you get the crit damage multiplier. That being said, compared to the base Golden Gun, Celestial is going to give you a 37% increase in damage, even with the base Golden Gun getting progressively more damage per shot. When you compare this to something like Star Eater's Scales, obviously it is going to be worse, but for the amount of burst damage you're getting off, I think it's pretty comparable. And the nice part about this for a lot of speedrunning bakes or low man bakes is you can pop Golden Gun and then swap to another exotic and then shoot off your Golden Gun when you come out of inventory and then go straight into another weapon swap rotation. It's still one of the best exotics in the entire game. I would tend to put it in S tier for specific bakes, but I think that's a bit biased. So I think A tier is a perfectly reasonable place. Next up is Wormhusk Crown. This is definitely way more of a PvP exotic. You can still definitely use it in PvE, where anytime you dodge, you're getting 67 HP straight back, which is almost identical to the Cure effect from the Solar 3.0 subclass whenever you're using that through like a healing grenade. That being said, your dodge comes back pretty infrequently compared to other healing abilities in the game, in my opinion. I know it has a very short cooldown, but if you're just using this and burning it purely for healing, I don't think Wormhusk is really that worth running. So that being said, I'm going to put it as a C tier exotic. You can definitely use it, and I would probably use it in certain situations over all the D tier exotics, but I just wouldn't really recommend it in any harder piece of content. Blight Ranger is up next. This does 3 very simple things. First off, as you're blocking with your Arc Staff, it doesn't consume any extra super energy. Then as you're blocking and a projectile hits it, it will be reflected, having a chance to hit enemies for 650% increased damage. And then lastly, as you're also taking hits while blocking, you're spewing out Orbs of Power constantly for your team to use. I think this is a pretty trash exotic for the first 2 things, and even the Orbs of Power aren't really insane for having to use Arc Staff. That being said, I could see it potentially being used to deposit a bunch of Orbs of Power in like one location and maybe use it for shoot to loot for boss bakes or some other reason for like surges. So I'm going to put it as a D tier exotic. You could argue, in my opinion, that it's an F tier, but I think it could have some slight niche potential in low man or raid settings. Mask of Acris used to be a pretty useful exotic, giving you a 10% increase in damage to arc and stasis weapons on top of everything else, but it was recently reworked to be a lot less useful, where now when you do that phase shift dodge, you're getting ×4 weapon surges for Arc and Stasis instead. The other downside is those ×4 surges only last for 11 seconds, which kind of sucks. In my opinion, any of these exotics that offer surges might as well just be replaced with 3 copies of surge mods on your boots. That being said, you might be able to find some niche situation where you can get ×3 like kinetic surges and then ×4 arc surges and do like an Izzy hothead rotation, which could be somewhat effective. But in my opinion, right now it's a C tier exotic. If it was the 10% on top of everything else like it used to be, you could argue it's probably more like a B or A tier. But I think now it's pretty useless. Graviton Forfeit is up next. So many people love this exotic for the infinite invis builds you can run. With this, while you're invis, your invis lasts 2 seconds longer at base, plus you get plus 100 reload speed, plus 100 recovery. So you can naturally run this build with low recov and high mobility and not really feel any negative effects. And then on top of that, while you're invis, you're getting 400% additional base regen for your melee. And this goes up to 600% when you're within 50 meters, I think, of one enemy. And then if it's 2 enemies you're within 50 meters of, that's now 800%. So you can just chain infinite invis on your melee abilities alone. I know a lot of people think this is an S tier or A tier exotic. In my opinion, unless you're doing like a solo Grandmaster Nightfall, I don't think this is useful. In any team-based setting, invis is just not the way to play the game. It's always much more of a crutch for you and your team than anything else. I think it's a cool exotic. I'm going to put it in B tier. You could easily argue it's A tier, and I would still agree with you. But in my opinion, I don't think invis is the best way to play the game. And compared to something like Omnioculus, I think Omni is a bit better because you can use it for infinite invis for you and your teammates and still have those 2 smoke bombs for increased weaken effects. Last up on the list, we do have Knucklehead Radar. Very simply, whenever you ADS, your radar just doesn't go away. This is an F tier exotic in my eyes. I think it's great for PvP. It has really no place in PvE. And that is the end of our Hunter exotic tier list. I did make this list over on tiermaker.com. It will be linked in the description. If you guys want, you can access the link and make your own version of the list for fun. That being said, I think I did a pretty good job at looking at this objectively and getting everything in the right spot that it should be in. You could always argue things could go up or down, like plus or minus 1 tier, but I think the A tier is pretty locked in and the S tier is pretty locked in. I wouldn't put any of these A tiers up in S tier ever, and I think these are by far the 5 best exotics currently in the game. As always, let me know in the comments below if you agree or disagree. Have a good one, guys. Peace.